We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming, everyone. I imagine there'll be a few more people wandering in. First ever engineering education talk at there, I think, right? Does anyone remember one previously? Anyway, so we're going to set the bar here today. So this is Dr. Julianna Gesun. She has bachelor's degrees both in human development and industrial engineering. Make sure I get this right, from University of Illinois. And then went on to get a PhD from Purdue in engineering education. And if you don't know, Purdue started engineering education. It's the oldest kind of founding, it's the place to be if you're doing engineering education, until we ramp ours up.
That's right.
This will be the place to be. And she did a postdoc at UNH, which is where I met her through a program there, and then went to Embry-Riddle, where she's doing a postdoc, but shifting to an assistant professor at some point. So pretty exciting. And she basically started the research on thriving, and I'm really excited to see her talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Can everyone in the back hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? Excellent, because usually I speak with a mic on, so today I just have to project. All right, so thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. I know how exciting this talk must be, and so I want to give you the option of choosing how you want to share your time. So how I want to allocate our time today is that I will provide a brief overview of engineering education, and then we get to decide for the rest of our time together if you want to sit back and listen passively or really engage and interact with what it means to thrive, what it feels like, and how you can learn to thrive. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. Before I dive into my own personal research, I want to provide an overview of engineering education, because I did hear that I'm the first engineering education speaker, so I want to provide an overview of what exactly is engineering education. How many people would be able to clearly articulate to me or feel comfortable clearly articulating right now if I were to ask, what is engineering education? Just show of hands if you are comfortable knowing exactly what it is. Great. Okay, nobody. Great. I'm glad we're starting here. Can I get a show of hands for people that have heard and understand what the term STEM is? The science, technology, engineering, math. Excellent. Almost full house of hands. So we'll start here. STEM. Typically, when I ask people what is STEM, here's a word cloud that has resulted in many of the responses I have heard in the past. For example, there's math, there's science like chemistry, computer science, there's engineering, there's studying, there's education. There's a lot of different components that go into STEM, because STEM as a whole is a very vast and broad field of study. So engineering education is a subset of STEM, right? So I want to position us so out of all of STEM out there, engineering education is a subset. And if we zoom in to engineering education, that is a whole field of study as well, where people focus on pedagogy, people can focus on the undergraduate level, doctoral level, children, informal, formal context, lots and lots of different fields of study. So engineering education is a vast and broad field within STEM. All right, so that being said, people might be wondering, all right, well, you've been around for about 20 to 30 years, depending on who you ask. How has the field grown? Well, over the past couple years, since engineering education got started, there has been a drastic increase in the total number of dollars that have been awarded to engineering education proposals. And this is just looking at NSF funding. And if you notice the bars, these are in millions of dollars of increments. So at this point, and this, I did this search in 2021, so this is 3 years outdated. But if we just take a look at this graph, we're already talking about billions of dollars invested into engineering education related research proposals. That level of productivity, and as we see an increase in the number of PhDs in engineering education, there's also been a rise in NSF awards, which also results in an increase in publications. So engineering education is reaching a growth spurt right now. We are rapidly growing. There's a lot of new departments emerging and even more schools interested in engineering education at the national and international level. So I want to go back to this diagram about engineering education and the vast and broad field that it covers, I developed and I study engineering thriving. Right there. So I want to position the work that I will present to you today as a subset of the vast and broad and ever-growing field of engineering education, which is also a subset of STEM as a whole, which all of you seem familiar with. So this is where I situate. I will not pretend that my work is at all representative of engineering education as a whole, but I hope to provide a snapshot and glimpse into a subset of the field. Okay, so people might be wondering, well, what got you interested in engineering education? It's a fairly new field. A lot of people haven't heard about it. And as Vicki introduced me earlier, I have undergraduate degrees in industrial engineering and human development. How did I end up in engineering education? And why do I study what I study? So I want to share my story with you, because my story of how I got here and my own experiences shapes the way I think about engineering thriving. It shapes the research questions that I ask. It shapes the way I conduct studies and how I analyze and present results. So let me share my story. During the first day of the first undergraduate engineering class that I have ever taken, I remember being in a large lecture hall of over 200 people. And then I saw my instructor walk into the room, get in front of the podium, and welcome the class. I remember at that time, I looked around and I saw that most students were bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, excited to change the world. We were so excited to be in college, let alone we're engineers. We're going to be engineers and change the world for the better. Okay, so back to the professor who greeted us by saying, welcome to your first day as an undergraduate engineering student. Now please look to your left, look to your right, and only one of you will survive in engineering. True story, unfortunately. But while the story is sad, the professor was right. Because by the last semester of my undergraduate engineering experience, only about a third of the students were still there. And of those who remained, looked frazzled and fried. No more changing the world for the better. It was, let me hold on for dear life. Let me just graduate and get out of here and move on with my life. Okay, very, very interesting transition. So you might remember, I wasn't just an engineering student. I also studied human development. And so I was always thinking to myself, what could be going on in the environmental factors and the contextual factors to see this kind of shift in the development of undergraduate engineering students? So one thing I noticed is when I looked around my environment, during finals week, the shuttles that take students around campus would say the struggle bus right there. Okay, I thought, all right, that's definitely sending a message about what my experience should be. And then I did a Google search for engineering students' mental health. And what I found was mental health problems, high anxiety, high stress, high depression. And not only are these mental health problems bad, but they are getting worse with time. So then I wondered, all right, this is a pretty grim picture so far. What does the peer-reviewed literature say about engineering culture? And so at the time when I started my PhD and did the literature review search, here is a snapshot of how undergraduate engineering culture has been described in the research. It's been described as hardship, suffering. It's very difficult. Lots of discrimination. So if you are an underrepresented minority group, it's even tougher for you. It's very competitive, problem-focused. And when we take this perspective of what it means to be an undergraduate engineering student, it's not entirely shocking that the four-year graduation rate in the United States for undergraduate engineering students is 30%, whereas the four-year graduation rate across all college majors is 60%. It's a big difference. So I know we just talked about a pretty grim picture of engineering culture and what it was like, but I do want to acknowledge that universities are trying to help. I remember walking around campus and seeing signs of if you are struggling, if you have anxiety or have suicidal thoughts, we have excellent therapists. If you failed a class, that's okay. We have remedial classes because we are here to help you. And then also, there's a lot of initiatives to let's stop hazing each other, let's be collaborative and welcoming here. So universities are trying to help, and there is a lot of effort towards helping students suffer less. But as an undergraduate engineering student, I wanted more out of life than to suffer less. So I became curious and interested during my PhD around what does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to function optimally, to reach my full potential? What would that look like in an engineering context and setting? So first, I became curious about prior research on general models of human thriving. And I'll present 3 examples. It is not crucial for you to read every word in these example models, but rather just see the structure of how they differ. The first model is Ikigai, which I actually saw a sign with Ikigai in this building, so maybe some people are already familiar with it. But this was developed as a model of well-being or a reason for being from Japan, and it's the combination of 4 different factors. So that's one example of how people have modeled and conceptualized human thriving. Contrast that with a model of flourishing developed based on K-12 students in Australia. And this model is more hierarchical in nature, where there is a foundation that leads to building various positive character strengths, which then lead to this experience of flourishing, which is very similar to thriving. Now contrast that model with Seligman's PERMA model, which is just a combination of 5 different factors. And with Seligman's PERMA model developed based on adults 18 to 65 across the whole world. What it means to thrive is just build as many of these competencies as possible, and you'll be thriving more. What was interesting is that I took existing survey instruments that were already developed based on these models, and I gave it to a large sample of engineering students. And what I found early on is that exploratory factor analysis showed a factor structure that did not fit the data. So this means that what it means to be an engineering student and thrive was different than what it meant to be a K-12 student in Australia, per se, or be someone in Japan with the Ikigai model. And one way I explained this difference is through the bioecological theory of development, which is the theory that human development or optimal child development, it could be any person in the middle. The optimal development of a human is an interactive process between who we are and our immediate environment and which skills and talents are valued, all the way up to larger social and cultural values that change over time. So then I wondered, because existing models of general human thriving were not applying well to undergraduate engineering student populations, then what does engineering thriving mean, and what does it look like? So to answer the first question, I developed a study that resulted in the definition of engineering thriving as the process by which undergraduate engineering students develop and refine competencies that allow them to function optimally in their academic, social, personal experiences and engineering programs. I've never been able to read that whole definition in one breath. But anyway, let's break it down into the components. The first key element is that engineering thriving is not meant to be binary, but rather a process. That's the first word highlighted. I do not want my work to be used to diagnose student A is thriving, but student B is not. But rather, thriving is a continual process of growth and development that we can all work on. The second and third words highlighted here emphasize that my work focuses within the unique context and population of undergraduate engineering students in engineering programs. And finally, I focus on competencies such as motivation, interest, belongingness. A lot of these competencies reside within an individual student's experience. And so that's how engineering thriving is defined. So now I want to open the floor to the audience. I'll give you 1 minute to think about how you want to share the rest of our time together. And I'll present you with 3 options. The first option is a traditional research talk. It is more passive. You don't have to engage. You can just sit back, relax, and listen. And the first option helps us explore how do we study thriving in ways that are methodologically sound. The second option is a little more personal. It's the so what impact. Why should I care? How does engineering thriving research help me become a better student or a better instructor or a better professor or staff member? And then the third option is very adventurous. It's for the people who want to be very interactive, to experience thriving. What does it feel like? How do I teach thriving in the classroom? It's very experiential, very hands-on, and but highly encourages audience participation. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it, and then we'll take a vote by a show of hands. Do we have any questions on what to do? Great. No hands. All right, ready, set, go. 30 seconds, and then we'll regroup. So nice I have a little clock here. Very helpful. If you could pick one, what is your top choice? You have 15 seconds left. We don't have time for all of them. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Does anyone need more time? Okay. And people on the Zoom, please put your vote in the chat. That would be helpful. For people that are present here today, can I get a show of hands for people who want the traditional research talk? Wow, nobody. Okay.
Come on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Show of hands for people who want to learn more about the impact, the so what. Why should I care? How does this help me? Okay, some hands. And then show of hands for those who want to be very adventurous, experience thriving. What does it feel like? Great. What about our Zoom? And they vote for the third option too. Okay. So I see that only the second and the third option has garnered votes. So we'll start with the third since that was more popular, and then we'll go back to option 2 because I think we only have time for 2. All right. So option 3 begins on slide 28. Okay. All right. So we will begin with being very interactive and experiencing thriving. Are we ready? Great. Let's get started. So for those, since most of you voted for experiencing thriving, let's experience thriving. How about that? I encourage everyone to take a moment, maybe stretch a little bit, but get really comfortable in your chair. For those that are kind of slouching, sitting back like this, maybe take a moment to evaluate your posture. Feel free to stretch a little bit. Roll your neck, get as comfortable as possible. And if you feel comfortable and ready, I encourage you to soften your gaze and or close your eyes for the next 2 or 3 minutes for this activity. I want you to imagine a time when you are thriving. Think about the best time of your life. And as your inner thoughts and vision become more clear, start to notice, where are you? Are you alone? Are you with other people? What are you doing? What do you see? And we'll just take a moment to enjoy the best time of your life and the memories that come with it. And notice how your body feels right now. Take a moment to notice how you're breathing.
How do you change the lock screen time for Mac?
And it seems like some people are coming back, so we'll slowly bring our attention back to the room. And if you could please open your eyes and look at me, that's how I'll know we're all back. Okay, great. So it looks like we're all back. So show of hands, how many people thought of something for a time when you were thriving and the best time of your life? Great. All right, so I want you to keep your hand up if what you imagined was Dartmouth engineering class. Either teaching it or taking it, or engineering in general. Right? That's why we're all here. Yeah, okay, great, excellent, the best time of your life. I'm so glad. So what's interesting about this exercise and activity is that I have done this activity all over the world. I have never seen a full classroom of hands come up when I said, how many people imagined engineering class? And I think that's really interesting because we spend so much time as instructors preparing for class, as students taking classes. Why aren't these optimal experiences for us or among the best times of our life right now, given it's a big reality of our lives? I also want to note that in prior times I've done this activity, and especially with my students, sometimes I ask for people to share what came to mind. And what's been fascinating is that everyone would share something different about the best time of their life. And I want to point this out because sometimes people come up to me and ask, hey, Julianna, tell me what I need to do to thrive. And I often say, I don't know, I can't read your mind. But notice the moments when your body was calm and breathing differently. And when you all were imagining the best times of your life, I noticed a lot of people were smiling, a lot of shoulders relaxed, and a lot of people seemed to be happier. And so a lot of my work on thriving, and especially when people want to experience thriving, The Body Keeps the Score is an excellent book that talks about how our feelings and our body help provide the compass towards what helps us thrive individually.
Sorry, I think I muted them.
Oh, are we good?
I think so.
Okay, thank you. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties, people on Zoom. Okay, so what was I saying? Yes, our feelings are a compass towards individual thriving. And so for example, one of my closest friends' idea of thriving is skydiving. And I am someone who's terrified of heights, so skydiving would not be a thriving experience for me. But through what is skydiving for one person really thriving and enjoyable, and for another person is really terrifying, ultimately, when we both think about experiences of thriving, physiologically, we both end up relaxing a little bit more. And there's this experience of, I can breathe a little easier, have a little more energy, a little more focus, or most people describe, I feel better when I think about an experience where I'm thriving compared to when I'm just surviving. So use that as a personal guide for you in shaping which experiences help you thrive. All right, so in terms of the personal impact, and when people ask me, all right, so now I have a compass to how I thrive, well, how do I actually get there? What does it mean to thrive? And I want to introduce this slide in terms of what thriving means. And first, I want to highlight that this is prior research done in the aftermath of catastrophe, what happens. And so first, my clicker isn't working. Okay, so first, most people start at a certain level of functioning. And what this diagram is showing is that when there is a major stressor, most people's immediate response is a decrease in functioning. So if I have an exam that was really important to me and I utterly failed it, I'm going to be pretty upset and maybe function a little less than optimally for a little bit later. Or if I have a death in the family or some traumatic event, most people experience some struggle immediately after. But what's interesting is that after the dip in functioning, people start to pivot into 4 broad categories of responses. Most people are fairly resilient and they will bounce back and to the similar level of functioning as what they had before, and or maybe slightly less, because it is hard to go through a lot of hardship. There is a small percentage of people that completely succumb, and without intervention, they are not able to function normally or to still be able to do the tasks that they want to do in daily life. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's also a small percentage of people that end up thriving, that because this catastrophe happened, I now have a greater ability to empathize and support other people who are challenging. I now have a greater sense of meaning and purpose in my life. I now recognize some of the stuff I have taken for granted before. So those are examples of people in the aftermath of catastrophe and adverse events that have learned to grow and function even better than they did before. So when people ask me, how do I thrive? And what does that mean? How do I just remove all the challenge in my life? I like to say, thriving is not removing challenges, but rather how we respond in the aftermath of the inevitable lows in life. So then the next question is, well, if there are 4 different outcomes, and these are all driven by actionable behavior patterns or ways of thinking that can determine which of the 4 categories I end up in, well, then how do I learn to thrive if my natural response is I'm barely recovering and or surviving in an environment where I'm bombarded with hardship? So in the next activity, I want to show an activity of what it's like to retrain ourselves to be more thrivers. Let's see this little girl in the corner crossing her arms. Can I get everyone to cross our arms just like her? Kind of like, Yeah, just like that. So let's take a moment and just notice, how does this feel? All right, take note of how your body feels. And now let's cross our arms the other way. It's okay if you need a moment. And now let's take a moment and notice, how does this feel? Show of hands if the first way of crossing your arms was way easier. Yeah, show of hands if you prefer the second way of crossing your hands. Nobody. Yes. So the second way of crossing our hands is what learning to thrive feels like. It's awkward and it's uncomfortable. Because for those who are not naturally thrivers, it's learning a new set of behavior patterns and changing the ways that we do things. When we talk about change, oftentimes it is the presence of adverse events that triggers a change in our lives. And change is hard because it represents a loss of routine, a loss of schedule, a loss in what feels normal. And so oftentimes when we experience this change and we're trying to figure out how to get situated into a new way of operating and being in the world, common sense becomes less common, or common sense is not so common, quote by Voltaire. And I want to illustrate this point because my mom frequently calls me. I've been an adult and left the house for many, many years, but my mom still frequently calls me and asks me, are you sleeping well? You should be sleeping at least 9 to 10 hours a night. You should be eating very nutritious foods. Make sure you have your vegetables. Make sure you're exercising. All of this is good for you. And I go, yes, Mom, I know. Knowledge, right? But even though I have this common sense, it doesn't mean that every day I'm really proud of myself for getting 9 or 10 hours of sleep or being able to exercise well and eat well and nutritious foods. I just can't. Or even though I know this is good for me, the actual behavior change it takes to implement all of these best practices is uncomfortable, is hard, and takes work. So knowledge is not enough when it comes to thriving. I can tell you all about the best practices and research on what people can do to work towards their thriving, but ultimately transformation requires application. And unless we actually learn to apply these principles and see the ways they change the ways we behave and operate and interact, it's just knowledge, which I should note is traditionally backwards from the way most engineering is taught. in which if we can help students understand a very difficult concept and have it make sense, knowledge is enough. We can apply it by putting the right numbers in the right parts in the equation, and it's fine. So teaching thriving requires that next step, where knowledge is not enough, and we need to be able to transform and change behaviors. So with that in mind, the next question is, how do I actually teach thriving in the engineering classroom if it's so different from the ways traditional engineering is taught? And I'd like to share that on the top QR code on the board right there, I put a QR code to my 3-minute thesis, where in 3 minutes I explain 5 years of research around how my engineering education work translates into helping educate engineering students in the classroom about thriving. But for now, I want to bring us into a sample lecture. And in this sample lecture, the learning objective is that truly diverse and inclusive environments stem from an awareness and appreciation of individual differences. And there are activities we can do to build awareness and appreciation. For example, mindfulness activities to build awareness, gratitude to build appreciation. It's one thing to have many different people in the room who think differently and look differently, but that can also be a source of tension. But to promote truly diverse and inclusive environments requires both an awareness and an appreciation that we are different and we can build on each other's strengths. So in the lectures, usually I usually start by presenting research on the topic. So in a snapshot, and I have all the citations there if you're interested in more information, practicing mindfulness and gratitude from the research has shown benefits for myself, for other people, and for both now in the present and benefits in the future. However, it is culturally dependent. I have just come back from a couple weeks in India, and there's been research in an India context that showed that traditional gratitude activities that have been done in Western individualist countries did not apply well to more collectivist countries. Namely, when participants were asked to think about things that they were grateful for, some of the Indian participants in this study reported that it didn't help them feel better, it helped them feel worse. Because this idea that, oh, so-and-so helped me out means now I owe so-and-so a favor. Now I'm indebted, and this is a burden to me. And so interestingly, in the ways we teach mindfulness and gratitude, I propose a more culturally aware or culturally responsive way of teaching, which is rather than focusing on what I owe other people, this idea of reciprocation, to focus on celebration. So in this activity, I want to give us about 30 seconds to think about, see if you can get to 10 things to celebrate and be grateful for. So let's take a moment to notice the good things that are happening in our lives and feel and celebrate them. Ready, set, go. Try to get to 10. You can write them down, you can keep track of it in your mind. Have 15 seconds left. Four, three, two, one. Let's come back to the room. Show of hands for people who felt like this was a very easy activity to get to 10 things to celebrate today. Great. Show of hands for people that kind of struggled, had trouble thinking up a lot of things to be grateful for. Yeah. And this is a common experience because one of the feedback that I have gotten, and I also, before going into results, I do want to highlight that in terms of practicing and building more mindfulness and gratitude, Dartmouth does pretty well. I did a Google search and I found that there's a mindfulness retreat coming up next week here. And then there's also a lot of mindful activities through the Student Wellness Center. So there is opportunities to be involved in the community at a culture that seems to already value mindfulness here. Okay, so back to the comments I get from my students. One of the comments I often hear is that, all right, now that I've done this activity, I've become more mindful of my lack of gratitude. This is really challenging. What do I do? And one of the responses I share is that's okay, because the first time I walk into a gym, I don't expect myself to be able to easily lift 200 pounds. We work from 5 pounds and then we build up to it. And similarly, if you're one of those people that really struggled to think about things to be grateful for, it's okay. I recommend, and from the research, there's this idea of reciprocal altruism, which is that it is easier to notice when people either help us or when there are reasons to celebrate in our environment, when we become more deliberate about helping other people and helping spread kindness as well. And this gets at the idea that we accept the love we think we deserve, which comes from the perks of being a wallflower. And some ways we can apply this in engineering education is by rethinking best practices in education. So being a good listener, being more patient, praising effort and persistence, grit, as well as celebrating and sharing small successes can be rethought of as ways to develop, to share more kindness with other people and thus help ourselves notice more moments to celebrate as well. And for more ideas about ways we can be kind, there is a Random Acts of Kindness Foundation as well that has many ideas of how we can train ourselves to be more mindful and build our gratitude. But the caveat is this only works if we don't expect anything in return. Kindness doesn't benefit us very much in terms of the benefits we saw in the prior slide if there's this sense of now so-and-so owes me and is indebted to me. So when I encourage you to share the benefits of being more mindful and grateful, try to act in a way that does not expect anything in return. So then I often get the question, well, how will learning to thrive benefit me in the long term? Yeah, I did a couple activities in this past 20 minutes, and does it really matter? I can't really see the results. And so I encourage people to think about a compounding effect in this case. That at the beginning, if we look at just 3% interest or compounding from economics, it's hard to see much difference. But then over multiple compounding periods, especially over a long period of time, we start to see an exponential increase if it's a positive 3% return or a negative 3% return yields a drastic decrease. And so the same can be said about learning to thrive. How many of us can think of people later in life that are just full of joy and glowing and very pleasant to be around, and people that have seemed to have lived a very thriving, high-functioning life? Can we all think of someone in that category? And now contrast that with, can we think of someone who seems very grumpy and very difficult to be around, and everything seems like a problem or challenging or difficult? Can we all come up with an example there? Great. So from those two examples, it's pretty easy to see that for someone who is full of kindness and joy and interested and motivated and just an inspiring presence to be near, that didn't happen from a lifetime investing in just barely surviving and being very, very miserable and just suffering a lot. A switch doesn't switch and change one day, but rather it all begins with what kind of owl we are operating in cultivating today. So that is the end of the first activity. We have about 15 minutes, and I'm wondering, would people be more interested in a Q&A for this, or are people more interested in a sneak peek about so what and why it matters? So show of hands if people want to learn more about the impact, the second part of the lecture. And how many people want to stop here and just do Q&A? No hands. Okay, so we'll do the second one. And how are our Zoom participants, out of curiosity? Okay, that's okay. So then for the rest of our time, let's talk about, so what? Why should I care about thriving in engineering education? All right, so in this section, I will focus on what is the impact of engineering thriving? How does it impact future research? How does it impact us personally? And what are some considerations for lecturers in terms of promoting spaces that promote more thriving in the classroom. So to begin, when I think about the long-term impact of engineering thriving, what guides me is the question, what if engineering students are known for thriving? And I would argue that this is a win-win-win-win situation. The first win is engineering students, because we know from prior research on general human thriving that when students learn to thrive in school, they also tend to perform better academically, they're more engaged, they're more motivated, and they retain better. The second win is institutions. We know from prior universities that have a dedicated focus on thriving that students who learn to thrive in college become alumni who are more willing to donate their money and time to help future students also be successful just as they have, out of gratitude and a desire for others to benefit. The third win is recruitment and outreach. In 2019, I was invited to give a keynote address at a conference that focused on how can we improve the messaging to young girls to be more interested in engineering. And one of the key findings from that conference is that we need to change some of the existing stereotypes in engineering that is scaring or turning a lot of women away, young girls away from pursuing engineering. These stereotypes include things like, oh, engineering is just too masculine, it's too difficult, it's not for me, I don't belong in this space. And instead, one of the recommendations is to switch to a narrative that engineering is a place where people can make a large impact in every facet of society. And that gets to the fourth area of impact, society at large. Gallup polls have shown that students who learn to thrive in college are more likely to thrive outside of college as well for the rest of life. And so when it comes to the societal impact of engineering, I encourage you to think for yourself, assuming competence, would you rather have thriving or barely surviving engineers design your medical equipment or phones or bridges? So when we think about impact, it's a win-win-win-win situation. I will very quickly and briefly talk about the research impact because this is a published paper and you can look at the citation if you're interested, is that we are moving from a dichotomous to an orthogonal perspective of wellness and stress. In this study, what we looked at was a latent profile analysis, which is a clustering method derived from Gaussian mixture modeling that looked at trends in how participants responded in a survey. And we noticed that there is impact in the ways we think about wellness and stress, and there are trends in shared experiences among subgroups. So for example, the students with the 4.0 GPAs were overrepresented in the low stress category and experiencing a lot of wellness, but they were also reported experiencing lots of stress due to conflicts and being frustrated. White men in particular were overrepresented in the low stress category, which makes sense as a generally more chill group, and then contrasted with white women, which were more represented in the high stress group, experiencing high anxiety, but also experiencing a lot of support, reporting that even though it is really tough and really I do feel really supported as well. Now contrast the white men group with the racially marginalized men group, which in this study was Black, Latinx, and indigenous groups of men, which we clustered together due to sample size. And that was the group that experienced a lot of gratitude for being in the field, though had a strong sense of not feeling as supported, which makes sense because most of this data came from predominantly white institutions. But what was interesting is that when we look at which factors were more predictive of a sense of belonging, the wellness factors as a whole was accounted for 43% of the variability in a sense of belonging, whereas the stress factors accounted for only 6% of the variability in belonging. So when we're thinking about environments of inclusion, the wellness factors had a lot more impact in how someone feels like this is a place where I want to be, where I can see myself becoming the best version of myself. And it's also interesting to note a lot of mixed experiences, that people who experienced high wellness were not across the board the same people who experienced low to no stress, but rather these two experiences often coexisted with each other. So rather than seeing wellness and stress as a continuous perspective, it was more now seen as two different axes where students can experience high stress and high wellness, or no stress, but it's also very boring and I'm not really enjoying my time there. So there's 4 different quadrants that we're looking at. We talked about the personal impact. How does this impact me? And when it comes to thriving, it's not about what happens to me, but rather how I respond. So thriving is not the absence of adverse events, but rather what happens in the aftermath and what I focus on that makes all the difference. And so when it comes to what do I focus on to help me thrive more, the next research impact here is that I categorized 147 different factors into 3 broader categories. One is the internal thriving competencies, how I am responding and reacting to a circumstance. The second category is more engineering culture, university resources, and contextual factors, which influence which assets and skills and knowledge and abilities are considered strengths. And then there's the outcomes. Did the student get a good grade? Did I reach my career goals? And out of these 3 elements, which one do you think we have the most direct and immediate control over? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it, and then we'll take a vote. 4, 3, 2, 1. How many people think we have most direct and immediate control over the outcomes that happen in my life? Nobody. How many people think that I have the most direct and immediate control over the context and cultural factors that I am part of? And how many people think I have the most direct and immediate control over my internal factors? Do I show up to class? Okay, so most people, yes, correct. So the only element out of these 3 broader categories that we have direct and immediate control over are the internal thriving competencies. So when it comes to how can I make the biggest impact in my own thriving, focus on what you have control over. And from the institutional perspective, what can we do to promote environments that are more conducive to thriving? Then focus on the context and cultural and resources factors from the institutional side. But yes, you all got that right. And then finally, when it comes to, so what? How does this work help me become a better instructor? I have 5 suggestions and recommendations that are developed based on prior research, my own experiences, and this phenomenal book called Bandwidth Recovery for Schools. And some of these recommendations include, 1, making sure that there are accessibility to different forms of technology and textbooks. So for example, when I was an undergraduate student, I couldn't afford some of the $200+ textbooks that I needed in the classes I was taking that semester. And so now as an instructor, I make sure that if I want my students to do readings, I provide an online PDF that they can all access, or I make sure that there are textbooks on reserve at the library. Second, acknowledging that there are multiple forms of participation. There's new studies that have come out acknowledging that there is power in what we say, but there is also power in what we don't say. So when some students choose not to actively talk in class, it doesn't necessarily mean that the student is not interested and engaged. And so there's recommendations to broaden what it means to participate, that rather than just evaluating who are the most extroverted and outgoing speakers in class, consider who's attending office hours or who is very engaged in online discussion boards, and kind of reframe the ways we think about participation and engagement with the class. Third is the importance of addressing test anxiety, which we know tends to disproportionately affect people in underrepresented minority groups. One of the things I suggest, one of the ways I address test anxiety is, as a yoga instructor, I invite students to show up to class right before a big exam, about 10 minutes early, and I provide everyone with a handout on some relaxation or stretching exercises that they can do, and we just take a moment to breathe and relax and experience a version of what you all experienced thriving earlier today. And that has been shown to be very helpful. Also, when it comes to providing feedback and who's talkative in class, there can be a concern that, oh, I think my question is a stupid question, or I don't know this content as well as other people, so I'm not as comfortable asking the questions. And to overcome this concern that I don't want to talk because I'm afraid my question is stupid, I provide an option for students to provide anonymous feedback to me throughout the whole semester on the online course, either Canvas or whichever online course venue that you use. And then at the beginning of the next class, I just read and address all the questions that were shared to me. So students learn to come early to class for the silly questions and or the serious questions as well. And then finally, when it comes to building environments that truly support diversity and inclusion, we need to look past just having different people in the room, but provide spaces for authentic connection. And one way that I support people to do this is in the first day of the first year engineering classes that I teach. I walk in front of the podium to my large class, and I encourage my students to please look to your left and look to your right and exchange email information or some way that you can contact each other so you can help and support each other, because we need each other to thrive, not just in school, but in life. And that is it for the second adventure, and that's all we have time for, and I'll open the floor for 5 minutes of questions. And the last thing I want to mention is I want to thank all the students in my lab that has helped